Let us sum up. What differences exist between the loan and the deposit? In the loan, the availability of the item is transferred and is lost for the duration of the loan. For example, if I lend my car to someone, I lose the availability of the car. If I lend a fungible good, I lose the availability of the fungible good, and I lose the ownership of the fungible good. Could you lend me a litre of oil? I seem to have run out. The borrower, the one who receives the loan, acquires the full ownership of the litre of oil lent to him. The proof lies in the fact that he consumes it. He uses it to fry potatoes or make a Spanish omelette. Afterward, his only obligation is to buy and return the equivalent in quantity and quality when the term of the loan concludes. So, in the loan, both availability and ownership are fully transferred. Meanwhile, in the deposit, take note, this is important, there are two possible theories. The first holds that because the specific molecules or parts of the fungible good are indistinguishable when the deposit is made, ownership is lost and is transferred to the depository. However, even if this is so, in no way is availability lost or transferred, because the depositor retains the availability of the good at all times. It is simply that the depository will fulfill her duty by keeping the equivalent in quantity and quality, or the tantundum, always at the disposal of the depositor. The depository will not be obliged to return the very same molecules or particles of oil, or the very same grains of wheat or euro banknotes, but the equivalent in quantity and quality. The second theory holds that not even ownership is transferred, because in the deposit of fungible goods, what is taken into account is ownership in the abstract, based on the equivalent in quantity and quality. Ownership does not reside in the specific particles of oil, or the specific grains of wheat, or the banknotes with specific numbers on them that the depositor hands over. Instead, he deposits and retains the availability and also the ownership of the good in the abstract sense, 10 euros for instance, regardless of the specific form it takes. The good may be 1 litre of Carbonell virgin olive oil, which is perfectly identifiable, or 1 quintal of wheat with certain characteristics. It makes no difference to me which theory you accept. What is important is that you understand clearly that in the deposit, the availability of the item is never transferred to the depository who receives it. Instead, the depository receives it with instructions to keep and safeguard it, and to have it always at the disposal of the depositor. And whenever he asks for it, the depository must return it. The equivalent in quantity and quality, in Latin the tantundum, to what was deposited. Now we will consider the essential differences from the economic standpoint. In the case of the loan, there is an exchange of present goods for future goods. I give up the ownership of present goods in exchange for having them returned to me within a year, along with interest, according to the category of time preference. In contrast, in the deposit, there is no exchange of present goods for future goods. There is no credit transaction. In fact, the depositor maintains the full availability of his money as if, or even more than if, he had it in his own pocket. Practically speaking, he says, "What are my cash balances?" Well, in my wallet, so many euros, at home, in the sock, and in the safe, so many, and in the demand deposit at the bank, so many. The money is mine. It is part of my cash balance. I do not want to lend it to anyone. There is no credit transaction. In the deposit, availability is not given up at all, but in the loan it is. Listen to what Mises very clearly states in another of his works, The Theory of Money and Credit. Mises writes that the deposit is not a credit transaction because the essential element, the exchange of present goods for future goods, is absent. As a result, a loan includes interest, as we have just seen, while a deposit does not include interest. There is no interest agreement. A deposit is assumed to be free, unless otherwise explicitly agreed upon. And if a payment is stipulated in a deposit, it is the depositor who must pay the depository. precisely so that she can cover the safekeeping expenses, and not the other way around. So, if I place some money on demand deposit with a banker, I must pay the banker a sum, a certain amount per thousand, etc., for safekeeping services, for keeping the money available to me at all times, for paying checks written to third parties, and for providing cashier services when I present a bank book. The customers who make deposits must pay the depository, the banker, and not the other way around. If you see the opposite happening, you should smell something fishy, as we will see and discuss in greater detail. Now let us consider the essential differences from the legal standpoint. The first involves what jurists call the cause, or the compensation, or roughly speaking, the incentive for the contract. The loan is handed over with the purpose of transferring availability to the borrower, who asks for and receives the loan. If I ask for a loan to buy myself a house or a car, etc., I need to be given the money to use, to spend on the purchase of the good in question. That is the essential cause of the contract. The loan would be useless to me if the lender said, "Yes, I will lend you the money, but you must not use it." No. Meanwhile, the cause or incentive for the deposit is the safekeeping, as if by a good paterfamilias, of the equivalent in quantity and quality to the original deposit. Please keep these 10 euros for me. The cause is safekeeping. It is a deposit, and you must always keep 10 euros in your wallet, either 2 5-euro bills or 1 10-euro bill, etc., available to me, because I can ask you for it at any time. Therefore, the first legal difference has to do with the distinct cause or incentive for the contract. In the loan, availability is transferred. In the deposit, it is not. The cause is safekeeping. Second, in the loan, there is always a term, after which the good must be returned. It is impossible to conceive of a loan without a term. Furthermore, if a loan contract has no term, the law states that the competent judge must set the term. Meanwhile, the deposit, due to its very nature, does not contain a term because a deposit is on demand. That is, whenever I ask you for it, you must return it to me, because I handed it over to you for safekeeping. At any time, I have the right to receive from you the tantundum, the equivalent in quantity and quality. In the loan, a term is set not only to specify when the loan must be returned, but also for the calculation of interest. Imagine I take out a 1-year loan at 8%. Well, at the end of the year, I must return the quantity of money lent to me plus 8 additional units per 100. Third and last, what is the obligation? The obligation of the depository is to keep the exact equivalent in quantity and quality, the tantundum, at the disposal of the depositor at all times. In the sphere of money, this is the same as saying that a 100% reserve ratio is necessary. Meanwhile, in the loan contract, the obligation of the borrower is to return the loan at the end of the term, along with interest. However, a lender must not ask for the money before the end of the term, because the essence of the loan lies precisely there, in the fact that the borrower spends the money on the purchase of the car, the house, or whatever, and until the term expires, he has no obligation to return the money. We would not be able to organize our lives if lenders could ask us at any time to return money lent to us. It would be like a sword of Damocles hanging over us, because the very reason we take out a loan is so that for a period of time we are not pressed for money. And we need that time period so that we can gradually save up money from our income to return the loan, or so that our industrial project, or whatever our investment is, can get off the ground. A term is set, and until the term expires, we have no obligation. Is that clear? We must understand that clearly, for all of the economic misfortunes we are now suffering stem from confusion between these two contracts. I have described two distinct contracts, with their different characteristics and consequences, and everyone has understood. But who invented these contracts? How have they emerged? We must make a slight digression, a brief analysis of the spontaneous process by which institutions form. The goal of an economic science is to study the spontaneous market order, and economists view the market as an extremely complex process of human interaction in which we all participate. One of the great surprises and wonders we find in economics is that there is an order which emerges on its own, without anyone's having designed it. And that order is precisely the object of research in economic science, without a ministry, an authority, or a social engineer to dictate what must be done. Merely through the interaction of human beings, men and women like you, and based on our nature, certain patterns develop spontaneously and give rise to institutions and the market, which are the economist's object of analysis and research. How do these institutions emerge? We must define an institution as any patterned behavior which emerges through evolution and custom over a very prolonged period of time. One of the great contributions of the Austrian school of economics, founded by Carl Menger, is that it was able to explain in detail, in analytical terms, the spontaneous emergence of institutions. In fact, Carl Menger does so impeccably in his theory on the emergence of money. Menger carries out the analysis in abstract terms, and he applies it to a concrete institution. He considers the emergence and evolution of money, though he expressly states that the same theory can be applied to any other type of social institution, such as the language we speak. The language we speak, Spanish, English, French, etc., was not discovered nor created by anyone. It is the result of a spontaneous evolutionary process. Morality and legal principles are also institutions which spontaneously emerge in an evolutionary manner. How? Well, it is very simple. A few people, a vanguard of mankind in certain historical circumstances, make the entrepreneurial discovery. The light bulb goes on for them, and they discover before everyone else that they better achieve their ends if they systematically adopt certain behaviors. For example, in the sphere of money, a few people realized, in a particular historical context, that the problem the double coincidence of wants posed in bartering was avoided if, in exchange for their goods in the market, people asked not for something they needed to directly consume, but instead for something they noticed was more frequently exchanged. And, depending on the historical circumstances, that good varied. What was used in ancient Egypt? Well, read the Bible. The swells of the Nile left such fertile soil that grains of wheat were used. In ancient Mesopotamia, head of cattle, etc. So people began to demand a certain good, not for direct consumption, but as a medium of exchange, with the idea of exchanging it in the future for what they really needed. Since that good changed hands very frequently, it was easier to find someone who, in exchange for wheat, for instance, could provide what one wanted. If that behavior is successful, then by a process of imitation, a second vanguard and a third and a fourth wave of human beings began to copy the successful behavior of the first people. And as a result, the chosen good is more and more demanded as a medium of exchange. That behavior pattern becomes more and more widespread. Well, once the behavior pattern is predominant among human beings in a particular society or culture, the institution emerges. And it makes no difference whether it is money or language. No one discovered Spanish, for instance. Linguistic studies show that it was in the mountains of Burgos that people began to speak Spanish in a way somewhat similar, though very archaic, to the way we speak it today, and that it began as a corruption of Latin. But Spanish did not suddenly appear by magic. Instead, one generation of people after another did their bit, contributed their own special characteristics, and proposed words that were refined until they came into general use. Spanish is still evolving even today. If we could travel in a time machine and compare the way Spanish is spoken 300 years from now with the way it is spoken now, we would find significant changes, though we might understand almost everything we heard. The same is true of law and morality. The great paradox and lesson of economics is that the institutions most important to human life, legal, moral, linguistic institutions, without which we could not understand each other, economic institutions, like money, etc., incorporate such a large volume of information, knowledge and experiences In fact, thousands and thousands of human beings have contributed first-hand knowledge and experiences over generations and generations, over extremely prolonged periods of history. These institutions incorporate a volume of information so large that it far surpasses the capacity for understanding and analysis that any one human being has, or that any group of human beings have, no matter how wise they are. To put it another way, though it may make us dizzy, the institutions most important to our lives and to civilization cannot have been deliberately designed by human beings, because they lack the necessary mental capacity. Without a doubt, these institutions have sprung from the interaction between many, many human beings over very lengthy periods of history. But such institutions have not been designed, nor will human beings ever be able to consciously and deliberately design them, because we lack the mental capacity to do so. In fact, if we insist on improving institutions from above, we destroy civilization. That is another of the messages of this course. We will consider it further when we study the theorem of the impossibility of socialism. An economist is a person who scientifically studies this spontaneous evolutionary process through which social institutions emerge and take shape. Of all the institutions, I have mentioned the most important ones, like money, which is the quintessential social institution, and all the others depend upon or follow it. For money permits an exponential and almost unlimited increase in exchanges. It is in exchanges that human beings need to talk with each other, to reach an understanding and close deals, and therefore what used to be numerous dialects spoken in different valleys converged into one language. For people would go down to the market, and to exchange some leftover milk or a cow, they would need to talk to the other person. And so dialects were gradually refined and gave rise to Spanish. And if there were numerous exchanges, people needed to close the deals, to seal them with a handshake. And so law emerged, legal principles and their implications, and also morality and manners, etc. These institutions gradually emerged through an evolutionary process, and the process and institutions are the object of research in economics. The great wonder of an economics course is the discovery that those spontaneous orders are not and cannot be deliberately constructed by human beings. If we insist on constructing and improving them, we destroy them. Also, we learn that they incorporate a volume of information which far exceeds the mental capacity of any human being or group of human beings, no matter how wise or good. Mankind's fatal sin is a sin of intellectual pride, of arrogance, of believing oneself God, and capable of improving society at whim through the use of coercive state power. We will see that to pursue this goal is to destroy society and create limitless conflicts, genocide, and suffering. This is the theorem of the impossibility of socialism, and we will study it when the time comes. At this point, it should be easy for us to grasp how general legal principles have been gradually refined in the specific area of the loan contract and the deposit contract, which we have analyzed. Of course, it is very easy for us to analyze them because they are already there, but they have emerged and been refined throughout an evolutionary process identical to the one I have just described. Who were the first economists? Or, to put it another way, even if they did not know it, who were the first theorists to begin to study these spontaneous orders in scientific terms? The answer is very simple: the great jurisconsults of the classical Roman period. They were the first to realize that law was a spontaneous order, the result of an evolutionary process. We even have documentary evidence. For example, in his work De Republica, Cicero states Cato, the great theorist of the Roman Republic. We read the following. According to Cicero, Cato points out that Roman jurists were already aware that Roman law was not the personal creation of one man, but of many, over generations and centuries. Here is the exact quote. "There never was in the world a man so clever as to foresee everything, and that even if we could concentrate all brains into the head of one man, it would be impossible for him to provide for everything at one time, without having the experience that comes from practice through a long period of history." The great theorists of Roman law were independent professionals. They were not government officials. Whenever a legal conflict arose, the individuals involved would turn to them for advice and for defense in the corresponding lawsuits. These jurisconsults did not attempt to be original or clever. Instead, they sought to discover the logic inherent in legal categories and institutions, or if you prefer, the fundamental principles which shape the rules that govern the behavior of human beings. Jurisconsults like Papinian, Paul, Ulpian, Gaius, and Modestinus. They did not know it. If we could get into a time machine and travel back to their era and ask them, "Are you economists?" they would say, "Are you crazy? Econo what? I am a jurist." But they were economists because they thought and studied and realized and discovered something the Greek philosophers had been incapable of discovering, no matter how smart and wise they were. Aristotle, Socrates, Plato. In fact, just the opposite. The great Greek philosophers completely overlooked the spontaneous market order. They did not understand it. They looked down on merchants. They laughed at and ridiculed entrepreneurs' sons who wished to continue working in their father's workshops. They admired social engineering and the dictatorship of Sparta versus the relatively freer spontaneous order of Athens. The Romans have generally been criticized as unoriginal and accused of having relied on the great philosophical, artistic and technical contributions of the Greeks. But certainly in the sphere of law and in the sphere of economics, the original ones were the Romans, and the ones who failed were the Greeks. In fact, the law, as a set of behavioral guidelines, did not exist in written form for centuries and centuries. Jurists asked questions, researched and analyzed, and it was there. There was no need to write it down, because it was there in the logic of human nature and human interactions. It was only very late in history, when the Western Empire had fallen into the hands of barbarians and the Eastern Empire was in danger, that an Eastern emperor, Justinian, feared that those legal principles and rules would be forgotten. And for the first time, he decided, and this was soon after the year 500, in the first quarter of the 6th century, he decided to have the law put in writing, so that it would not be lost. And since the 16th century, that law code has been known as the Corpus Juris Civilis. But until that very late period in history, the law did not exist in written form, because there was no need to write it down. We could say it was written metaphorically in gold letters, in our very nature, and jurists simply had to discover, refine, interpret, and apply to concrete cases principles that were already known. It was as if someone said, "Let us record the essence of human nature." Listen, that is not necessary, because human beings are there in the flesh, walking, existing, living, acting, creating. We need only analyze them. Well, the chapter we are commenting on from my book, Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles, concludes with a study of the principles, according to Roman law, which govern the monetary irregular deposit contract. Ulpian very clearly states that to loan is one thing, and to deposit is another. In the digest, it is plainly stipulated in several places that someone who receives a good on deposit and uses it instead of guarding and keeping it constantly available to the depositor is guilty of the crime of theft, which natural law prohibits. And you will see the distinction jurists make in the case of a banker who goes bankrupt. They distinguish between depositors and people who have made loans at interest to the bank, and they state that the former have absolute priority over the latter. The two contracts are radically different. According to Ulpian, if I make a deposit at the bank, I have absolute priority. But if I make a loan to the bank in exchange for interest, that is another matter, and I have no priority if my banker goes bankrupt. Ulpian distinguishes between two contracts that are radically different, even if they are made with the same person: the deposit contract for safekeeping and the loan contract. And finally, a brief reference should be made to the so-called depositum confessatum. If a depository, whether of wheat, oil or money, appropriates the good and uses it for his own business deals, he is a criminal, and he has committed the crime of misappropriation, theft under Roman law. And furthermore, apart from all the penalties he faces as a criminal, he is obliged to return the good with interest, and rightly so. For a number of reasons, and without any basis, The three monotheistic religions prohibited loans at interest. In fact, the Catholic Church retracted, and in the 19th century, lending at interest ceased to be a sin. How many people died thinking they were going to hell, when lending at interest is actually an innocent transaction? And because a society cannot function without interest, all sorts of subterfuge were sought, and one method was to disguise the loan as a deposit, since charging interest was prohibited. So, before a notary, people would state that they were making a deposit. Well, as you know, excusatio non petita, accusatio manifesta. There is no need to declare an obvious truth. It's like when you come in the door and your child says to you, "Dad, it wasn't me," and you haven't asked him anything. Then you know he's guilty. Something has happened and he is guilty. Well, a person who solemnly declared before a notary, "This is a deposit," was not making a deposit, but since being caught making a loan would cost him his life, and not only this life, but the next as well, he had to declare that it was a deposit, and he would conspire with the depository. The depositor would say, "Listen, please do not return my deposit. A year from now, I will ask you for it. And since you will be sentenced to pay interest, you can pay me the interest." And what was really a loan was disguised as a deposit in which the contract was violated. Take note, because this is important. For 1,000 years, confusion has existed between the two institutions, and it stems from a historical accident, the canonical prohibition of usury. When the distinction between the two institutions became blurred, the situation became more favorable to the emergence of fractional reserve banking, in violation of general legal principles, as we will see, and also more favorable to the emergence of the current state of affairs, which provokes credit expansion, malinvestment, financial crises, and economic recessions. Minor historical causes produce major and extremely destructive effects, and even today we are still suffering from these.